One term we've heard again and again as more VTuber companies implode is black company. To those unfamiliar with Japanese work culture, this may be a term you've never heard before. Usually this term refers to companies that take advantage of young workers in various ways, like forcing them to work unpaid overtime or subjecting them to verbal abuse. So why has this term been popping up again and again in the VTuber sphere? Essentially, over time, it's come to light that more and more companies have been operating like these black companies behind the scenes, treating talents unfairly and subjecting them to inhumane treatment. And as more and more VTuber companies open up, and in turn many later close and are exposed, it's important that companies take time to reflect and learn from the past mistakes of others before the cycle repeats and more people are hurt. Especially because I don't think most companies intend to cause their talents any harm. It's true that every industry has its growing pains, but at some point, changes need to be made. As a VTuber myself, it's something I think about a lot. What are the solutions, if there even are any? As far as an actual answer, I don't really know. But here's some thoughts that have been running through my brain. After the dissolution of many small corpos, it may seem crazy, but more and more corpos continue to pop up. Despite some of the outlier situations, I genuinely don't think most corpos are born from predatory intentions, and just either aren't able to become profitable enough to stay afloat or aren't able to figure out how to effectively run a business. A quick Google search shows that business startups have a 10 to 20% chance of being successful over time, so it's really not abnormal or unexpected for even the majority of agencies to go under, especially when the market is so young and volatile and the COVID boom that exploded live streaming as a medium has ended. This means more talents with a smaller pool of active viewers than VTubing at its peak, so the industry has become incredibly competitive. Everyone is fighting for the same viewers because viewers can only be spread out so far if the overall number of VTuber fans is either not changing much or even declining. That being said, even despite all the corpo closures, talents continue to audition for and join new corpos. And why is that? I'll explain some of the reasons. To start, VTuber models are expensive! There are budget options like PNG streaming, VRoid, or mass-produced models, but it's much easier to market yourself when you have a brand and visual design that is unique to you. So it's not a surprise that most people want a high-quality, unique live 2D model if they intend on pursuing the field professionally. And jumping into an agency will give you not only that unique model without startup costs in the 4 digits, but ideally a marketing jumpstart as part of a company generation, where the entire generation can not only foster a sense of belonging and connection, but a way for talents to piggyback off of each other's success whenever any of the talents are trending. VTubing is also hard and involves a lot more behind-the-scenes tasks to juggle than people may anticipate. So ideally, in the long term, having a management team also ensures a VTuber will get the help they need managing these behind-the-scenes aspects, as well as advocating for fair pay regarding things like sponsorships and other opportunities, so, you don't get scammed. In a perfect world, these are reasons that joining a company can be enticing. However, expectations don't always live up to reality. And as the medium has grown over time, we hear about more and more companies that have allegedly taken advantage of talents in various ways instead of helping them. Everything from demanding huge payouts and putting the costs on the talents despite company failures to overworking talents to straight up grooming have become a lot more commonplace than we would like to hear, to the point that some people question if corpos of any size have any business existing at all. But being indie is not so easy either. Having to judge everything yourself is incredibly exhausting and a huge financial risk. And to be brutally honest, I don't think I could personally handle being indie full-time. And I've spoken to many indie VTubers about how hard it is. And while some people thrive after leaving their companies, and it's great to see, others are exhausted and desperate for help. For many, going corpo may be the only way they can pursue the medium professionally instead of as a hobby. However, there are a lot of issues with the majority of corpos in general, as things currently stand. All of these are, of course, just my thoughts, so feel free to share your own thoughts in the comments if you have different views, if you agree or if you disagree, whatever. To start, I wanted to tear apart the very core of corpo VTubing and criticize the use of the term agency at all. As someone who is corpo but not part of an agency, I know I have a bit of a unique position here. As the CEO of PlayAsia, I don't belong to an agency, but I'm the face of a company. By the way, if you enjoyed the video, purchasing any VTuber goods from the link in the description helps support the channel while also grabbing merch of your Oshi. We got lots of HoloLive goods, some indie VTuber goods, and most importantly, plushies of me! But anyway, in my case, it's a bit more obvious that I'm an employee of some sort rather than someone who's part of an agency. But I'm going to argue that's what every VTuber is. Not someone who works under an agency, but an employee. An agency is an organization that is working or providing a service for you. You're not working for an agency unless you are an agent. And in other fields like real estate or entertainment, it's not abnormal for people to part from their agencies and move to a competitor if the current agency just isn't suiting their needs, because the agency just provides a service for someone. For the sake of this video, I'm going to compare VTuber agencies to talent agencies because it's genuinely the closest match I can really think of for this analogy. In entertainment, agents typically take 10 to 20% cut of a talent's pay, though admittedly, it was hard to find information on whether this amount is different in Japan, and Japan did set the standard for VTubing. The agent's job is to market the talent and help them find opportunities, but the agent is working for and providing the talent a service, not the other way around. Talents may have contracts with an agency, but they aren't directly considered staff of the agency, and the majority of the pay goes to the talent. Why then is it normal for some VTuber agencies to have cuts way above this threshold and still refer to themselves as agencies? If the agency is taking the majority of the income, or even half, is the talent not being exploited if they are not provided an alternate source of income? With the exception of groups like Bishoujo or Mythic Talent, which function much closer to a traditional talent agency by only taking cuts of sponsorships they help negotiate, at least from what I understand. That being said, sometimes actors do hire a manager on top of an agent, and that does end up costing more, making it a bit closer to the fees that VTubers pay. But this would still often be around 35% combined, which is above the agency VTuber standard. I also know that VTuber wages can cover assets like models, overlays, and events, which otherwise performers may pay for out of pocket or via sponsor funds if self-hosted. So that may also come into play. But in my opinion, these still aren't agencies at all. But they should be redefined as what they are: companies hiring contract workers. And unfortunately, for many people, this ends up meaning that they're a contract worker being paid lower than minimum wage if they can't amass a large enough following, which lots definitely do, but I'm sure many don't. I'm not saying agencies are entirely evil. I just think the label is incorrect. But again, this is only my opinion, and things are different, so it's not a one-to-one comparison. To start, the vast majority of VTuber companies own their talents, models, and IPs. While this does make sense from a business standpoint, as they are company assets, over time this can pose a problem for talents when conflict arises. Being a VTuber is not the same as voicing a character in a cartoon or video game. Though recasts in those can be completely disheartening as well, sometimes characters are reinvented or recast for different reasons as time goes on. At the end of the day, the characters are scripted and aren't, at their core, the actor, even if the actor does help bring them to life. So a recast may be jarring initially, but it doesn't undermine the entire identity of the character themselves. With VTubing, the situation is quite different. As many reincarnations have proven, people aren't there for the character so much as they're there for the person behind them. The VTuber persona is seen less as a fictional character and more as an extension of the real person's identity. In the few instances a VTuber has been recast, it was usually to heavy backlash because it just wasn't the same person anymore. And that makes sense! When the talent spends hours and hours making live content and improvising, no one else can possibly embody the character in the same way. So when a talent decides to leave a company, for whatever reason, and whether on good terms or bad, it essentially means the retirement of the character entirely, which makes it hard for talents to leave, because they don't want to lose this character they've become so attached to, or leave their fan bases behind. However, I also understand this from a business perspective, as otherwise talents may audition for companies with the intent of taking their character and leaving as soon as their contract is up, essentially using them as a stepping stone for a free model instead of having any intention of staying with the company. However, I do believe there needs to be a fair middle ground that can satisfy both companies and talents. The main reason I say this is because in other types of agencies, you can decide to leave your agency and continue your professional career as part of another agency. In fact, It's often normal for people to move up in the world to bigger and more established agencies as their career advances. I understand how in VTubing this may be a bit different, as the company does invest in making the model in the first place, and the long-term profit is expected to repay the initial startup cost. But maybe there's another way. First of all, let's jump back to companies taking such a large cut of their talent's pay. I do understand the rationale, as models and assets have a significant startup cost and it is necessary for companies to repay this in addition to paying their other staff, but there should be ways for talents to pay off this debt over time. For example, contracts could make a stipulation that a certain percentage of the company's cut be dedicated to paying off assets. I do think it's fair for contracts to lock talents in for a defined period of time, which usually is around a year for most already, but after that period of time, I genuinely believe that talents should have the option to leave their company while keeping their IP at no further cost if this percentage has paid off their assets. This ensures that the company has made some profit on their end as well, but that the costs of the assets have also been covered, preventing anyone from just taking a free model and running, leaving the company in debt. If the assets have not been entirely paid off at that point, there should be an option for talents to pay the remainder of the initial cost to keep the IP, but they should not be asked to pay the full amount the company has paid at the start. It's a compromise that, while not perfect, I do think would be more fair to both the VTuber and the company. Because if a celebrity leaves their agency IRL, they aren't asked to pay a fee based on how many followers they've amassed to keep their social media. It's something the talent has worked for themselves. And while I do understand in the case of VTubing they don't legally own those assets, I do think it's equally absurd to say that they belong solely to the company when it's so entwined with that creator's identity. It also gives the creator more dignity upon leaving instead of restarting from zero. While this would still suck for people who did not earn as much as anticipated, if their assets haven't been fully paid off, I do believe it is the fairest option, because it's equally unfair to put all the risk on the company and demand that talents receive these assets entirely for free in cases of the company being in the red. That being said, if the company goes under entirely, in a perfect world, all assets should be released to the talent at no charge. I greatly respect that this is what Prism Project and Production Kawaii chose to do, allowing the talents to continue their legacy if they chose to do so. It makes no sense to resell models or even accounts and their existing following when there would only be backlash from the community, leaving their worth virtually at zero value in anyone else's hands, no matter how much they may have cost initially. The most insane thing I've seen has been a company demanding money from talents, even ones who did not keep their IP, after the company ceased existing, to pay back the money that had been invested in them. As far as I can tell, tweets regarding this have since been deleted, so perhaps the situation has worked out and I won't call them out directly, but under no circumstances is this okay. No other job would demand you pay back your training or whatever after the company goes under. A job is a job, and just because a company can't continue paying you doesn't mean you owe them money on the way out the door. It's not like you're legally responsible for the company's earnings. It's the CEO's problem if things go under, not yours. Anyway, back to being able to leave with your IP. The reason I believe companies should offer this option in one way or another after their costs have been covered and a minimum time requirement has been met stems back to the fact that agencies should work for you and not the other way around. Agencies shouldn't hold talents hostage by holding their IP above their heads like a carrot on a stick. They should retain talent by providing ample reasons for the talent to want to stay. Whether that is financial incentive by connecting them to sponsorships, creative incentive by providing unique opportunities and guidance, or some other type of valuable support, agencies should take people leaving as a sign they need to do better. If a company's too afraid to take this risk, in my opinion, they're focusing on the wrong things and aren't working in the talent's or the industry's best interests. There's no incentive to do better if they can continue to pump out large numbers of new talents to coast on their donations while providing less and less support over time, trapping talents in a situation with little support while desperate not to let down their fans by leaving. By being confident enough to offer a way out if the company isn't living up to expectations, they're challenging themselves to do better. This will help the industry to improve and grow over time in a way that benefits streamers and companies, and prevents companies with bad interests from popping up. Corpos will be forced to think outside the box to continuously retain talent, and in working to one-up each other as talents would have the option to agency hop, the industry can become truly innovative while trying new things. And talents truly stuck in abusive or unsatisfactory situations, or even situations that are good but just don't suit them personally, can have an easier out if it's just not working for them. I understand this is definitely an idealistic suggestion to make, and it's probably way harder said than done. I'm not saying agencies are all evil by any means. It's just a way I'd love to see the industry standard change. Furthermore, I do think the disclosure of past lives should be left up to the VTuber's own discretion, instead of seen as forbidden. I understand that it might break kayfabe a bit, but at the same time, wouldn't it be great if you could immediately find your Oshi once they're reborn, if they clearly want to be found? At the end of the day, we all know that a real person is behind the model and the character isn't real. It should be up to the talents, not the companies, how much people choose to disclose or not. Some people may want to keep it a secret and genuinely make a fresh start, but others likely know their communities are mourning the loss of their Oshi and wish they could say anything at all. This idea that it must be forbidden knowledge, even in cases VTubers themselves wish to share, is absurd, when it could only benefit the company by bringing in their existing fans. This culture where graduation feels like the end is just heartbreaking, and it's basically the worst thing imaginable to happen to your Oshi, especially when they do reincarnate but you just never find them. If we could just be more transparent and celebrate when people get into new companies or decide to go indie, it wouldn't just be easier on the talents knowing their regulars would find them, but easier on the fans who won't have to lose their Oshi. God knows we could all use a bit less of a gut punch every time we stumble across a graduation announcement, so it'd just ease the transition a little when we know someone isn't actually graduating. At the bare minimum, I do like HoloLive's recent shift to having an affiliate option, as it does allow graduating VTubers to remain active to an extent, while also allowing them to move on and pursue other things outside of the company. This way, at least the door is left open in some way for future opportunities or in case something changes, but they also aren't locked in to continuing to pursue something that no longer suits their current desires or needs. It may not be a perfect solution, but it's a generous start for those who aren't ready to part with their persona. One other thing that has never made sense to me is company exclusivity over all activity. Though that is something that exists elsewhere in the entertainment industry, I don't think it's something that ever benefits the talent in the VTuber sphere, and I was honestly shocked when I found out that it happens at all. There isn't a single agency in existence with complete freedom, and it's actually okay for corpos to try to direct their talent to make certain content or focus on certain things, but this can lead to burnout. As long as the talent works under a company, it makes sense that certain expectations will need to be met to maintain the company's image and protect it from legal issues. That being said, as a creative, our brains rarely work like this, and being locked into a very rigid structure can be the fastest way for us to burn out and become depressed. The easiest way to remedy this, just allow talents to have a side channel or creative outlet outside of the company. That way, they can pursue things they enjoy on the side to keep themselves happy, while the company presence maintains a certain image or content type. Hell, I did this myself when music was not performing well on my channel. Every time I released a cover, it would perform poorly, causing subsequent videos on the channel to perform poorly. But it's also something I'm passionate about, and the idea of not making music at all to help the channel grow was just heartbreaking. So I decided to make music elsewhere. It hasn't taken all my attention away from my main channel, but instead gave me an outlet to prevent burnout by continuing to do the things I enjoy, without doing something that I knew was actively hurting my channel. I can understand rules against monetizing side channels, as viewers may just donate to the indie account to subvert the company taking a cut, which would be a conflict of interest, but as just a creative outlet, it shouldn't be discouraged, let alone banned, if it means talent can be happier and healthier in the long run. This could also be a great opportunity for talents who don't want to graduate entirely, but might want to experiment with other avenues and rediscover their spark. I can see potential issues if people neglect their company channels and fail to meet minimum requirements, but it shouldn't become normal to control what people do with their lives outside of the workplace as long as they meet requirements. If a talent wants to use their personal time on personal projects, it should be permitted. That being said, it is true that any controversy stirred up on a personal account would likely indirectly harm the reputation of the company, but if you can't trust someone to keep things professional, it's probably not someone you should have hired in the first place. Another idea that I do understand would be challenging, but I do believe would hugely motivate new streamers to invest more time into their content, is for agencies to always offer a minimum salary. There are companies that do this already, but many only offer a percentage split, which means some people may end up putting in immense amounts of work only to earn below minimum wage, or even end up not making enough to pay their bills during a bad month. Expecting a minimum amount of effort to be put into the channel without a minimum amount of compensation is not a way anyone can thrive in the long term, especially just starting out when they're still growing. While it may seem fair on the surface to put the financial risk on both the company and the streamer equally, just imagine this being any other job. If you have a bad day at work, you aren't going to be subjected to no pay just because you had no customers that day. So why should being a VTuber under a company be any different? If there's no minimum requirements, it's a bit more understandable, as the talent can simply stream less if they need to prioritize other ways of paying their bills. But requiring intense effort after full-time work is not something everyone is able to maintain. It can also put talents in financial danger if they physically aren't able to handle streaming expectations on top of work obligations and earnings aren't as anticipated before debut. At a minimum, I believe companies that have stream hours per week requirements should offer no less than minimum wage for the required stream hours each week. This wouldn't cover any off-stream work, but it's at least a compromise for time that must be dedicated to the company. Of course, if a talent decides to go over this minimum time and stream additional hours, that would be a personal choice, and the company should not be held financially accountable for those hours. But I do think it's questionable that it's so normal for companies to have required hours without basic compensation. In most other jobs, this is literally illegal. I also believe that in addition to models, companies should either provide the bare minimum in terms of stream assets, such as overlays and BGM, or allow talents to use mass-produced assets. Under no circumstances should talents be expected to go into debt and invest in these things themselves before debut, not even knowing how things will play out financially. Especially when corpo debuts have higher expectations overall than indie, so they may feel pressured into spending a lot of money. Of course, if the company doesn't have the money and they want to have original assets, the talent should be permitted to provide or commission their own assets if they wish, but expecting the talents to take that kind of financial risk, in my opinion, is taking advantage of the talent's desperation to debut. If a company wants a debut of a certain caliber, they need to provide the startup costs themselves. If they're unwilling to provide, mass-produced assets may not provide the most unique branding, but they can get the job done and look great until proper assets can be afforded. Otherwise, you're spending a lot of money up front, only for a company to take a large portion of the money that could pay back your invested funds. If you're putting in a large portion of the risk, the company shouldn't be reaping most of the rewards. In the past, the main goal of getting into an agency was to grow as a content creator. In this day and age, however, some of the top streamers out there are indie, and creators have popped up all over available to commission high-quality models, so going corpo doesn't necessarily guarantee a higher quality model, assets, or marketing. In this era of VTubing, companies mainly offer a free model, a sense of belonging in a group, and a kickstart to marketing. This is especially enticing for people who may not be able to afford the quality they'd like on their own, as it is possible, but expensive. But indie has become more and more enticing for many, as it offers complete freedom if you can manage the startup costs. And many high-profile creators have been opting to debut indie. If you're willing to meet a company in the middle and make some compromises, a company may still be the best fit for you. But there will always be compromise, no matter how rose-colored a company may look. Being unhappy with certain parts of the job doesn't always mean a company is a black company. It may just mean it's not the best fit for you personally. You wouldn't riot in an office job just because they don't let you do only the tasks that you love. There's always going to be give and take when you're answering to someone. And sometimes that take becomes too much and you just want out. And that's okay and shouldn't be discouraged if it's really what's best for you. Even if a company isn't a black company, feeling stunted creatively should be a valid reason to leave if it's overwhelming you. People and companies both change over time. And in every other industry, transferring departments, companies, or even jobs entirely is completely normal. Some people thrive with total freedom, and others thrive when given a clear direction. Neither approach is better. They're just different. And sometimes preferences can even change over time. This is part of why I think agency hopping should be a norm, not a rarity. And things like agencies adopting existing talents and existing talents going indie with their company IP should be more commonplace. Whether a talent and company's creative visions no longer align, or whether the talent has grown and a company no longer suits their needs, more people would be happy if this was just more commonplace while keeping their IP. It has nothing to do with loyalty and everything to do with business. You can't expect someone to perform at their best if they're genuinely not happy with their current situation. People shouldn't be guilt-tripped for putting their own needs first, especially in a job where you're so emotionally vulnerable. Again, I understand things aren't this way because companies want to retain their talents, but I still argue that they should retain talents by making themselves valuable to work with, not by guilt-tripping or manipulating talents into staying until the point they break. That not only hurts the talent, but hurts their content and in turn, the company's reputation when things inevitably come to light. As the market grows and changes, more and more small companies find themselves unable to deliver on their promises and become forced to shut down. This leaves many people in a state of uncertainty, fearing for their jobs and their fan bases. But it doesn't have to be this way. And I think the best way to move forward for any new talents brought on in the future is to have a clause from the start explicitly stating what happens to the IP if operations are shut down in the future. At least if clear expectations are set, talents can have a backup plan from the start. So if the inevitable happens, they aren't left blindsided and wondering what to do next. In an ideal world, I would love for all talents to be able to keep their IP upon a corpo's closure, but it can be more complicated than that. I was grateful when I first saw Prism Project and Production Kawaii taking this approach and was hoping it would become the norm. However, I do understand that this is an ideal, and it's not always possible in the real world if companies are forced to do things like liquidate assets. Even if, as I said above, the assets are essentially worthless in anyone's hands other than the original talent, legal and financial representatives may disagree, and the company's hands may be tied if they're already in the red. If there is some sort of legally binding contract in advance stating what will happen to these assets, perhaps it would leave more options to prevent this from happening. Because with how many corpos have ceased operations, it's arrogant to assume your new company will be the one to escape this fate. While you should, of course, operate with long-term success in mind, it's not something that can be guaranteed in this field. And a backup plan in advance can set your talents up for better success if things fall to the wayside. Because in the end, many of us are just so tired of seeing talent end up as collateral damage when companies have no choice but to close. However, in such cases that assets can't be kept, whether due to company refusal or talent lacking the funds, talents should at their minimum be able to very openly state, if they wish, where they will be next, so that dedicated fans can still find them. I do very much appreciate that companies like AN Project and Pixelink allowed at least this for talents without financial ability to buy their IP once these companies announce their closures. It's still heartbreaking and not a perfect solution, but it's better than having them seemingly disappear entirely if the company's hands are genuinely tied. It doesn't cost them anything, especially if they're closing anyway, to just allow their communities to follow their next steps. To close the end of my long rant, these are just some ways in which the industry could potentially change. Are all of these changes easy? Or even possible? Probably not. As we're entering half a decade since the big VTuber boom, things have changed a lot since the industry became much more mainstream. And as results and expectations change, why shouldn't we reinvent the industry from the ground up as we learn, in ways that may better allow both companies and talents to thrive? Maybe some things will change, maybe they won't. But what we do know is that right now, there are a lot of issues and a lot of people hurting, and many of us would love nothing more than to see our Oshi happy and thriving until they choose to retire, rather than have them endure any pain. What do you think of these ideas? Have any ideas of your own? Let me know in the comments.